In fact, if anything, these low confidence reports are only getting louder and it's becoming more political. I mean, I'm on the database of the Science Media Centre in the UK. We get a question almost every day at the moment because this is so much in the public eye. And it's not because there was new data, it's because it's becoming more of a political issue, but also because the people who are being asked as the scientific referees are not scientists who know about it. Yeah. They are particular actors that have their own political motivations to be selling a narrative, and that is devoid of any further data or science.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster because on the one hand, we have science and they say, look, we don't have perfect certainty, which you never have with outbreaks usually, but we have actionable certainty. We have a reasonably high degree of confidence that this is how the pandemic started, meaning via the Huanan market and a direct spillover from the animals there. Maybe we don't. Hello, everybody again. So we just had a conversation with C Hughes about the recent Liu et al. Paper on Sam's channel. And we discussed a bit in depth what goes wrong with science in China, why this paper is not super trustworthy, what does it mean for the origins of COVID, and why it has been so difficult for Chinese scientists to speak out. We didn't really get to talk too much about the wider work, the wider implications about, spillover events, the human-animal interface, the drivers of pandemics and zoonotic spillover as Ellie sees them. And so because we had the previous conversation, I thought we would use the opportunity to connect these two videos and give the full picture about this a little bit. And I think it's important now that, the scientific evidence more clearly points to this link towards wildlife, maybe via raccoon dogs, maybe via some other intermediate animal that's getting smuggled. So pangolins was also still in the mix because there was a recent paper from Shisheng Li's lab about a pangolin with a MERS-like coronavirus being caught at the border again. So maybe Alice, can you share a little bit about the idea? How could the virus have come to the Huanan market before it started the first outbreak?
So first off, pangolins are super strange animals. From what we know, they have relatively primitive, weak immune systems, which means they can pick up viruses relatively easily. And of course, they're a high value animal. They breed very poorly in captivity, and they are therefore generally transported for wildlife trade. We know that in southern China, the borders were incredibly porous. I mean, my students would be on buses with wildlife being transported, and then they'd get to the Chinese border and the wildlife wouldn't be on the bus anymore, but the people who had the wildlife were. So we know things were coming in. In fact, when I first moved to China, we would occasionally see pangolins for sale in the markets.
So can you elaborate on this point a bit? You mean students what were your students doing on these buses? What are we doing?
Well, my students were mainly Southeast Asian students. So sometimes they would have gone home, or they might have just had a holiday in places like Laos because travel before the pandemic was easy. Yeah. And my old institute was a couple of miles from the border of Laos. And so people were openly transporting wildlife on these buses because it's a cheap way of doing it. Now, the reality is that with the ease of transporting wildlife across the regions, and these borders were so porous that sometimes my colleagues would be doing fieldwork and they'd look at their GPS at the end of the day and realize they'd accidentally walked into Myanmar during the course of the day. Yeah. So if you don't know what country you are in, it is easy to bring anything in with you. This means that centering where the animals that might have had these viruses came from is very, very difficult because we don't know what those trade flows look like. Now, pangolins are very good at carrying these viruses, but they are animals that are likely to be being transported with other animals, which means that if they are being transported with sick animals, they could easily have picked them up during the course of transport. And so we don't have enough data from them. They are incredibly rare to know if it did come from them. Raccoon dogs, however, and the evidence again today shows that there is a strong link, which actually I first heard a rumor of in April 2020 from the early swabs of the market, which were, of course, established around that time, but the data was not released as transparently as people might have liked. Now, raccoon dogs, like many of their cousins, other carnivores and the mustelids, are very good at basically being a great intermediate host for these viruses. They also, as anyone who has dealt with these animals will testify, they're not the cleanest of animals. So if you've got them in a farm environment, if you've got them in transport, if they urinate, etc., it's going to go everywhere. This means that if you're transporting animals in highly stressed conditions, as of course they will be, then they are likely to spread it to each other. And because there are fur farms, some of which were actually partly paid for by poverty alleviation strategies, wildlife farming was encouraged, you're going to get a mixture of captive bred and wild animals. And with the stress conditions, with the poor biosafety, you've got a huge capacity for
so
spreading.
we have to drill down here a little bit, because this was high density information, and I know there's several more things that can be said about this. So first and foremost, yes, there's a chance that pangolin trade can come all the way from Africa. I mean, how the hell did they pick up MERS, right?
So they can come from Africa. Now, within the pangolins, also important to note. So, of course, your listeners have very different backgrounds. There are actually 3 different genera of pangolins. All of the ones in Asia are the genus Manis. Yes. Now, they're all endangered or even critically endangered. And at the moment, the most evidence we have is from those Asian clades. So, yes, African species may have it, but we don't have clear evidence for that yet. It's much more likely, if it does come from a pangolin route, that it comes from Asian pangolins, and a lot of the transport is coming from places like Malaysia in that case.
All right, very good. So just for the listeners, why Malaysia, why Laos, why in northern Thailand? What is so special on this region?
I mean, Asia, and I mean, I've been working here since 2008 because it's one of the most threatened regions of the planet from a biodiversity perspective. So you have highly fragmented forests that are very diverse. You have a very high human population density in close proximity to those forests. That means in terms of things like the risk of spillover, we have a very high spillover risk because we're fragmenting ecosystems. We are increasing the interface between humans and wildlife. We are stressing them out, forcing them to use suboptimal areas, forcing wildlife to interact with pets, with other domesticated animals, livestock. And so all of those create an interface where you can actually get this movement of any viruses being spilled over into animals that we interact with and then into humans. Now,
but this wouldn't necessarily cause an outbreak if it's in a remote enough area, right?
No. So there's a couple of really important things to note there. One, and most zoonoses do have a wildlife origin. There are some, of course, that come from livestock, but most of them come from wildlife. Now, most of those are going to be local level. Something else that also needs to be considered is that rural populations have co-evolved with these viruses for millennia. They are likely to have acquired immunity. In fact, it's likely that I was immune to COVID before COVID was a thing because I've handled thousands of bats. And so one potential why the initial waves of the virus did not actually spread much within Asia is many people in this region may already have been immune because it was very similar to wild viruses that were circulating. And only when we had more variant strains later were people here likely to have been more susceptible.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? So because you said something, you might have already been immune. So you know that this will invite some questions later in our conversation about the risk of virus hunting, the risk of maybe also the risk of researchers bringing this to the what seems to be the Department of Energy's theory, researchers bringing it to Wuhan and causing the outbreak there. So you will have a chance to refute this later, but let's first stay at the biodiversity, at the immunity, because there is now increasing data. So there was a recent publication by, what was the name again? That found 12% immunity in people who handle wildlife or just going into the woods for logging, wood. And this is also something that, this deforestation is a huge contributing factor. So maybe you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So let's think about vaccines. Now, of course, the earliest vaccines were things like the smallpox vaccine. Now, the smallpox vaccine was using cowpox, and that was an alternative to literally giving people the virus and shutting them in a room and then hoping they didn't die, which is what preceded vaccines. Being exposed to low doses of these viruses is the equivalent of a vaccine. It's likely to not be enough to give you the infection, but it's enough that your body learns how to react. And so, for those who are handling wildlife, eating small amounts of wildlife, they are likely to already have acquired immunity because they've been exposed to low doses of it. But this is where we also have a problem now. We have humans moving around. We have the new railway that will connect Bangkok with Kunming. You have people moving through areas where they have no immunity to anything that is there. And as people will know from when they go to India and they get Delhi belly because they're eating foods where they're not used to it, or they're drinking water. If we do not have immunity, if we're not used to being exposed to it, we are much more vulnerable to getting sick. That means that, okay, let's say that the virus came from Mojang in southern Yunnan. Now, if people are exposed there, then okay, they've had a very high dose and they get sick. But the other people around them may have enough immunity that it's unlikely to spread. Those people get transported to a hospital in Wuhan that doesn't have good biosafety within the hospital. No one has immunity. There is where you have a risk. And I will stop for a minute and pause on the Mojang incident itself, because it is also relevant here, given that that's a reference data set for many of the things that have come since. Now, everyone says, oh, the miners went in and they got sick from going in a mine.
Yeah.
The reality is that's highly improbable that all of them are going to go in and they are all going to get sick from just being exposed to what's there. What's much more likely is they ate bats or other wildlife, and so they ingested a very high dose of pathogens, and they are much more likely to get sick. That's how spillover often happens. And then, of course, people say, well, why didn't they just admit that? And the reality is, eating bats happens all the time, but it is frowned upon. If you have done an activity which is of dubious legality, you don't admit to it. You admit to something else. And so it is very likely that those people were eating bats. It is very, very common across most of Southeast Asia, including South China. Approximately a third to half the caves we survey have evidence of recent hunting. And so they were exposed to a very high dose, and that means that they didn't have sufficient immunity to combat it. But it did not spread because the people around them were likely to have had a level of immunity.
Yes.
Transfer that same incident into somewhere where no one has immunity, and you have a very different situation.
Yes, this has also been modeled previously. So there's a Baker and al. Paper in 2021 that basically makes the same argument. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, the original Wuhan virus that broke out, is actually not that crazily infectious. So it's not easy for it to get its R above 1, right? And become a stable transmission chain. So it's more likely to die out. On the way, in between, at the village level, let's put it like that. But of course, if you bring it into an environment where there's, loads of people that are completely immune naive, then, the chance that, it spills over multiple times, and some of these will be productive enough to start, forward transmission chains, then, the odds are higher. But even that, they say, odds were not crazy high. So there's that, if it would have been only one spillover, odds are still 70% it would have, terminated by itself. But if you have, let's say, infected raccoon dogs at the market over weeks, infecting other animals, infecting humans that walk, immune native humans that walk past.
Infecting things like cats that are going through the markets eating stuff. And then going into people's homes and licking their cereal bowls or whatever. There are multiple routes that can amplify it, yes.
So it's a bit of a different picture, right? When you're thinking about a human-animal interface versus, just an abstract, oh, it's a lottery win and somebody gets it and brings it and that's it. No, this is not how it works. It's a numbers game. You're talking about interfaces. You talk about local interfaces. You talk about new interfaces. So local interfaces with new transport hubs, or, new interfaces created by wildlife trade, by fur farming, and so forth. Is that a concise summary?
Yeah. No, that's a good picture of it. And I think these are details that get missed by a lot of people who are trying to understand what happened and why we ended up where we ended up. But of course, critically important details if we want to prevent the next pandemic, which will happen, because we're not very good at learning as a species. I think Homo sapiens is kind of a misnomer. We're not living up to that name particularly well.
So this idea, and Philip might have another place he wants to go, or he might want to do this at a later time. But this idea, it seems, and we're we're not entirely privy to all the information that the Department of Energy has, but their running hypothesis appears to be, and it might be different when everything comes out, that maybe there was sampling done. Viruses were brought back to Wuhan, possibly to the Wuhan CDC, which is close to the market, and that would help to explain why the early cases seem to be around there. What's the likelihood of that possibly being the genesis of the pandemic? How much sampling is done there and the likelihood of bringing it back? Have you got any kind of thoughts on that hypothesis, if that's what they're kind of running with?
So again, it's a complex story. That lab was working on bat viruses. That lab had sampled from across Yunnan. From what I have heard, they had tried and failed to set up colonies of bats 3 times, but they had failed. Things like rhinolophids do not generally do well in captivity. Mm-hmm. But there is no evidence that suggests that they had these particular viruses, and there is nothing to link them strongly to the market itself. And so there is a possibility, but there is nothing to substantiate that. There is no causal linkage, and there are much more parsimonious routes, such as through the raccoon dogs, which, as we saw, as we've known for quite a while, were likely to have been carrying coronaviruses. And so I think it would be best looked upon as a red herring, because there are not those linkages, and there is no data in their database that links them strongly to this. Plus, there are much simpler and easier to explain reasons why it would have got to the market.
But it can, at this point, not really be ruled out, right? That is something that, so for the lableak, I mean, people that are familiar a little bit with the history of the lableak, it is as a term that just is subsuming too many different hypotheses at once. So
I was going to say, if you're going to do this at the market,
yeah,
and with the Wuhan CDC, then all of the stuff about furin cleavage sites and building this virus from scratch, or it being a bioweapon and all this WIV stuff suddenly goes out of the window, right? And you've sort of collapsed down to this. But that's not what we see in the discourse. We've got WIV stuff flying around. We've got restriction sites. We got the Wuhan CDC and it all becomes a big kind of mud monster where they just take a bit from here and a bit from here and a bit from here and a bit from here. And it's like, well, all of these things could work, but there's no kind of, no one ever wants to present, here's how it's, here's what was being done, here's how it got to the market, here's what explains all of the data. I keep asking someone to give me an estimate of probability of extant data we see, given that it came from a lab. And nobody kind of wants to do that step through from start to finish to explain why we see what we see. But the key point I'm trying to get across is, if you're going to go with Wuhan CDC, all your WIV stuff goes off to one side, right?
Yeah. And I mean, being in this field, every time a new paper comes out, you get sent it a dozen times. And with all the, oh, look, this proves it's artificial, I don't need to read it to know that there's going to be problems with it. And within days, you'll see the problems being highlighted. People are trying to fit data to their theories rather than looking at the data empirically and saying, look, that this still remains the most likely theory. And of course, working in a scientific institute, people will have those debates with you. And I say, okay, let's compare it to the wild type. People are saying that this has to be artificial because of XYZ. Look and see if it's some wild type that we have actually sampled from wildlife. It will be there. And of course, within days, they find, there is nothing unique. There is nothing artificial. See this all in nature. And so we need to stop trying to look for something that's not there. And look at the hard evidence and also see where it takes us, because the most important thing is we don't put our lives on hold again the way all of us have had to have done through the pandemic. I mean, all of us have made sacrifices at multiple levels. We will see that happening again unless we learn from it. And instead, we seem to be playing this never-ending blame game of trying to point the finger rather than actually seeking genuine solutions. The reality is, okay, next time it probably won't come from China. It will come from somewhere like Indonesia, where I was looking yesterday at their quota of annual traded wildlife, because Indonesia likes exploiting its wildlife. It still has an annual quota on flying foxes to export for consumption. Like, These are very real risks that we are doing absolutely nothing about. Wildlife consumption continues across this region like every other. Fragmentation, deforestation, mining, all of these have continued or increased. And we are going to see more spillovers, which could have similar effects, unless we actually put practices in place to prevent that from happening again.
So I think this is exactly the right thing to talk about, and this is why I like having you on, because you have a very down to earth look. Whatever, and Sam also is known to say this. Whatever the occurrence with one single pandemic is, it's just gonna be about the masses, because we have entered a century where human exploitation, transportation hubs, innovation, technology, everything comes together to create more pandemics. Everything is optimized now to facilitate viral spread, and if you're gonna make plans, you have to address all risks, right? And people keep getting distracted by, what about biosecurity in labs? And I know Alice is very critical about building more biosecurity labs, for example. And we can talk about this also a little bit if it doesn't explode the thing.
I will make a note on that in a minute. Something else that needs to be noted is we're also seeing an infrastructure boom in areas where there wasn't much infrastructure before. We are seeing increasing mobility in populations that have not traveled much. They are all going to be fairly naive to a lot of different viruses. Now, as we have seen with this pandemic, if you have a naive population that all gets exposed to a virus, then it can spread and it can mutate. And that means that other populations can become susceptible. We need to be very aware that as we join up those hubs across places like Central Asia and other regions, we are going to see more of these kinds of problems. And we need to put mechanisms in place to prevent these kinds of things from happening again. Otherwise, they will.
Good. Sam, quick question in between.
No, I'm quite happy with that. I mean,
so I think there's still a bit of a confusion in people, because now when you lay it out, it's like, okay, there's this risk, but people have no real, they have no real connection to this risk. They don't understand. They understand in the abstract, okay, yes, it's not good to go to the rainforest, chuck it down and, eat chop up the monkeys and get Ebola. So of course they understand this conceptually, but what they maybe understand a little bit less is like how little we actually know about the biodiversity that is out there and the biology that drives a lot of these viral dynamics. And I think you have a new paper coming, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit.
I will just say, Phil, I think it's very easy for people in the West, particularly, who are a lot of the people who are throwing stuff back and forward on Twitter, to not really have a handle on the things that people in these communities suffer from, right? It's very easy when I'm walking around in a populated city in the UK to be like, okay, maybe there's a bit of flu about and this kind of thing. But there's not a lot of these novel viruses that tend to spill over into my community. Whereas if you live in one of these communities that's right on the edge of, Southeast Asia, it's probably much more of a concern to you, right? Yeah. And it's probably far more at the forefront of your mind. Whereas we probably see it as like, biosecurity is probably more of a risk in a Western mindset than this kind of natural spillover. I think that's probably part of what drives people to be more fearful towards a lableak, perhaps. Is that, do you think that's fair, Alice?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think there is also I want to find a way that makes me feel less vulnerable, and it happening because of poor regulation in a country. The other side of the world is more comforting than me thinking, actually, this could have happened down the road. And people like that sense of security. Something we really don't know much about, though, is how environmental factors can exponentially increase these risks. There was a really nice paper that came out not long ago from Australia with the case of Hendra. Now, Hendra is a virus that can affect humans, and normally horses are the intermediate host. And it's a really nice case study about how complex the dynamics in these systems are, because when there is a big cyclone or something, it will often knock mother bats to the ground and the mothers die, and humans will go and they will hand rear the offspring. Humans never directly got Hendra from those bats that they were handling, that they would have in their houses, that they would treat like sky puppies, literally. But what has happened is key roosts have been destroyed, And during particular times of year when there are poor climatic factors like droughts, etc., because the bats are foraging in mango trees and horse pastures, the fluids are then being basically eaten by the horses get hendra, and then they pass it on to humans. Now, the reason that that is happening is because humans destroyed key habitat. And so then when the bats are already stressed because of drought and because of those seasonal factors, we get these dynamics, and that is when you get spillover. Now, we are only just truly appreciating that in a place like Australia where we have very good data.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to understand that in parts of the world where we have far less data. And so, I mean, I have students from across Southeast Asia. One of my students was meant to be advising on what to do about Nipah in India. Again, a bat-borne virus that normally you have a little extra something in your toddy wine called Nipah from bats urinating in it. Yeah. Not the kind of cocktail you would generally want, but trying to prevent it. And most people just blame the bats. And so I was like, well, so what are they doing? Oh, they're throwing firecrackers at the bats. I mean, what you definitely don't want to do with animals that are carrying a pathogen is stress them out and make them move, because then they are going to basically be stressed. So they're going to shed more of whatever they have, and then they're going to go somewhere and they're going to spread it more.
Yeah,
and so trying to develop these kinds of solutions is essential. And for many of the areas of the world where we have the highest risk, we have the least data on how to manage what that risk looks like.
No, I think that's fair. Also, when I did some Nipah research, I mean, something that happened is, for example, you have new palm trees, and then you have, like you said, the bats get pushed away from their natural habitats. They start roosting in the palm trees, but then the humans get up to the palm trees to drink the sap, because they don't drink the fermented wine because it's alcoholic, and they are Muslim in Bangladesh, so they usually prefer the raw sap to drink. It's a very tasty thing. But if a bat happened to be contaminating this, you might get Nipah, and then there's high risk of dying. So it's and it's happened repeatedly, right? It's
it has.
So
and these
terrible.
kinds of things are very genuine risks, and they are things that are not properly appreciated.
But I really want to drill down on the seasonality, because this is something that has stumbled me since the beginning. So when we talk about SARS again, so COVID, and also SARS-1, there is a certain seasonality pattern, right? So both diseases started basically in November. So, and how does this go with the bat roosting? Is there increased activity from bats during certain times of the year that also could hypercharge recombination? And this finally brings us back to your paper. What did you find when you looked at these bats and how many viruses they carry and recombination?
So the bats in the parts of the world that we're looking at now are typically breeding around April, May time. Now, bats like challenges. So bats actually have the biggest offspring for body size of any mammal. It's approximately 25% of the mother's weight at birth, and they will sometimes fly around carrying that. So huge ecological stress. Like they're very energetically expensive. And you're coming to the later part of the year, you've had a bat that's had a very long gestation, had a huge baby. You're going to have some very stressed out individuals just coming before winter. And so given that the climate at that time of year is also going to be critical to whether or not they get enough food. In parts of Southeast Asia, we also have monsoon, and monsoon is not a good time to forage because bats lose a lot of energy and they fly very inefficiently if they are wet and they get cold. And that really shortens the period of the night that they can forage in, meaning that a lot of them might be in very poor condition. And just like us, if they're in poor condition, they may be more susceptible to being sick. Yeah. Now, what we found within some of our own work is they can have more than one coronavirus at once, which means that there is the potential for new recombination. And what other work has also shown is that these animals are able to hold multiple different viruses at the same time. Now, typically, they won't show any symptoms. There is rarely any symptoms. But the fact that they can host multiple viruses at once and there is the potential for recombination means that we do very genuinely have a potential problem if these systems are then mismanaged and they come into contact with things that they could then spread that virus to through, for example, destroying all their habitat and forcing them to forage or roost in suboptimal habitat where they will encounter other animals.
So just for the viewers, recombination means that if you have two viruses in the same cell, they can change genetic elements. And for coronaviruses, it is known that this dramatically speeds up their evolution. And coronaviruses are highly recombinogenic. So their genomes are basically, puzzle pieces where they exchange with other coronaviruses. And this is why their evolutionary history is not necessarily linear, but depends on the segment that they have. And this is something that we only learned kind of recently to relate down now that we have, this scientific interest in them. And this really means that, the potential for creating, new viruses that have new abilities, like, either, swapping interference cleavage site or even swapping out RNA binding domains that are, generalist in a certain sense, that can bind, human, raccoon, dog, deer, whatever, is way higher in these environments where you have a lot of pets stressed at this time, multiple virus infected already, multiple colonies even coming together, starting breeding. And then the only thing left that you need is some foraging raccoon dog eating those bats that, that don't make it, and or bats flying over, some fur farms.
Defecating and urinating.
Exactly. And then, you already have plenty of spillovers. And indeed, if people look, Peter Daszak and EcoHealth were one of these people that really showed that you have tens of thousands of spillovers anyways of these coronaviruses. It's just like Alice said, because they are so abundant, because most of them are not, didn't win the genetic lottery. Most of them just sizzle out or never really reach transmission chains in these environments. But sometimes, especially when we now talk about the wildlife trade and the fur farming, this can, create some potential then to really hit the big city. And this is what Michael Warby says. Once it hit the big city, things are starting to look bad for humans.
Got to throw in that point then, Philip, at this point where talking about recombination, since we last talked to you, Alice, some of our friends in the, shall we say, more lableak leaning community have put out an analysis suggesting that the SARS-CoV-2 joke.
I think both friends and analysis are being a little bit generous.
I'm trying to keep the psychos at bay as much as possible.
I think it's too late for that.
Put out a Bible code analysis, shall we say, suggesting that SARS-CoV-2 couldn't have developed from a single virus, completely threw out of the window recombination in this. And they said, even if you did include recombination, it relies on a virus known as RPYN06, which apparently is very likely fabricated by yourself and other scientists to foil this analysis. So I wondered if you had any...
did you know in 2021
how to... whole cloth? Yeah, Philip, sorry.
Did you know in 2021 that the viruses that you identified would later thwart a synthetic origins analysis performed way later?
Yeah.
Isn't real data inconvenient when it doesn't fit your theory?
Yeah, it's super inconvenient. My God, better get rid of it.
I think the best, the least said about this person, I think the better, because I don't want to mention their name because it's quite clear that they're looking for attention on these kind of things.
The likelihood of not commenting on these videos is pretty low. I lived in mainland China most of 9 years. I did not foresee a global pandemic being the reason that I would decide it was a wise thing to move jobs. Like, I had a great group there. There is very little motivation for any scientist to decide that rather than just getting on with their life and their job, they are going to put themselves in the global spotlight. They are going to be subjected to the degree of scrutiny that most of us have been. It's not what people are going to do for fun. But the reality is that as scientists, we have a duty to do the best we can with our science, and answers are needed. Now, those answers are not, let's chase down Bat Zero, which probably died a few years ago. The answers are, how do we understand the dynamics enough that we can stop this from happening again? it is also in the context of when science gets transformed to a blame game, pointing out what is real and what is not. Now, last year, I decided that having not really been able to talk about a lot of this when I was in mainland China, because we were not allowed to talk about it. I would get hauled in front of people when I did. Or when my name would get quoted, which was sometimes without me knowing it was going to be quoted.
Can we talk a little bit about this? I think there's a lot of mystery about how is control exerted by Chinese authorities and how scientists, I mean, most scientists, also the few Chinese scientists I know about, they are well-meaning. They are scientists. They are not part of some conspiracy. They just try
Illuminati.
Yeah,
despite the emails that invite
they just
you to join.
try to do good science within the circumstances.
Well, let's see. That even leans on today's evidence, right?
And
because people are worrying that this is a CCP ploy and something has popped up, then it's disappeared. So
Alice, what about this censorship they talk about? What would people say to you when you get vocal about certain unwelcome things? So how can one understand this? What is a realistic example?
The first thing to note is most of the people here are going to be watching on YouTube or Twitter, both of which are blocked by the Great Firewall. In the West, we have a free press. China, there is not a free press. In fact, there is very high degrees of censorship, to the degree to which if you post certain things like certain fictional bears or as an image on WeChat, then it will be deleted. Now, if you post that in a group, it will not be visible to other group members, but you won't be aware of that unless you look at their screen. These are sophisticated modes of censorship that go across all parts of life. Now, when it came to the pandemic, we were not meant to be talking about the origins of the pandemic. Now, that wasn't to cover anything up. It was because the narrative was meant to be being controlled, just decided on, or the science that went out was going to basically have some degree of checking by authorities. It wasn't necessarily because anything was being covered up. It was because of the need for control.
Yeah, so this is something maybe just to say to our viewers. So this is not COVID specific by any means. When there is a crisis in China, the natural tendency is to shut down information channels for good or bad. And, only then figure out how to move forward, what to say, what not to say, right? And of course...
Well, I mean, here is another example for you. Yeah. Many people heard about the elephants going to Kunming before the Convention on Biodiversity. What they didn't know is there was a second herd of elephants that moved into our institute and that was literally residing between our accommodation block and the research centre. We weren't meant to talk to anyone about that. Again, we got vetoed from doing that because apparently it could look bad on the institute. And we could have been hauled up in front of people for talking about elephants in the institute. Now, that is something that should not be controversial. But that is a very good example of how information is controlled in an area where information flow works in a very different way. So when I was in China, I was not allowed to talk about it. And because you don't know what's being recorded, you do worry about even having a conversation in case it gets heard, because it became such a politicized issue. But last year an analysis went out, and actually I was quite vindicated today when they were using the same data that he said did not have any positive SARS-CoV in, and it did. An analysis went out saying that they'd sampled thousands of bats and none of them had had coronaviruses related to this. Now, there were many, many flaws with that data. I won't go into depth now. One of them was that they said they were sampling from our institute before the pandemic. Now, my institute was remote and there were not many caves. There was literally no reason on earth they would go down there because they would not have known about caves. The only reason that was stated in the analysis was because they could say, oh, but we checked and we didn't find anything, so it's obviously false. That was not asked for by any authority. It was created because the scientists who were doing it thought this is the convenient narrative now. Not having any coronavirus in China is a convenient narrative. Obviously implausible, obviously in contrast to over a decade of work prior, in contrast to work being done in surrounding countries, which shows that without any doubt, bats are carrying coronaviruses. And yet that paper went out. And when it could not be published internationally, it was published in the Chinese journal. Now, this is an example of what the narrative turned to. We just don't want it to have come from here.
You said you have been vindicated about this recently? What was the vindication?
Well, the thing that came out today was using some of the same related data that he said did not have SARS-CoV-2 in it. And it was the same scientist said that didn't. And we now know it did, because that was what the publications this morning were using, that same data set. Now, I knew it had been cherry picked because I know that there was no legitimate way they could come up with 100% negative. Plus, none of their supplements added up either. They were clearly either only reporting what they wanted from the data and ignoring the rest, or it was just false. Probably a mixture of the two. The reality is that there is no benefit to China now saying, actually, that data that we said didn't have anything positive in before did actually, and it came from wildlife. Like, that isn't a convenient narrative, especially at this juncture, because it could undermine other parts of their narrative. The reality is that is what the data shows. It is what the data has always shown, and it is not Chinese scientists reporting it. It is just that is what the data is, and now it is being analyzed. It is very clearly showing the raccoon dogs in that market, unsurprisingly, were carrying these viruses.
So I have to do a little bit of pushback because I've been investigating this story here, and I already challenged Eddie Holmes when he said this is basically bullshit, that they didn't find anything. So just to give you some idea, so when Xi Li was looking for SARS-related viruses all over China, or at least in multiple locations, she never really found a lot of SARS-CoV-2 related. She only ever found Red G13. So the odds that, this other author that we don't want to name right now, made up that they couldn't find it, this is something, just because you found them doesn't necessarily mean that they are fraudulently producing this data. It could really be that they either, had some sampling biases, or that they were honestly reporting on their results, maybe over-interpreting them because not, appropriately giving the limitations proper hearing of what they were doing. But it is plausible, at least because Xi Li had no, she only ever found one after tens of years of sampling. She only ever found one. It's not absurd to think that another scientist who sampled for a year all over China didn't find any, per se. Yeah. What would you say to that?
So a few points to pick up on. It is true that the rhinolophid bats are the best at carrying SARS-CoV viruses. The best way to catch them is with harp traps, which most people in China do not use. We had ours specially made, and then we actually lent versions to other people so they could have them made. So yes, it's perfectly plausible that they didn't catch rhinolophid bats, and so they weren't sampling for it. However, and this is where and why I am convinced that it was fabricated. For one, they said that they sampled from the same place as us, and they explicitly state that within their paper. It is almost impossible that that was true, and when John Cohen asked them, they could not give a response on that. There is literally no reason for them to drive for several hours from a major city to a single cave that they would not have known existed. Also, their supplements didn't add up. So when they had certain data quoted in text, it was mismatched with supplemental data. And there were some other inconsistencies that just make it very unlikely that it was an honest reporting of things. So whilst it is true that if they were honestly sampling because they were using probably mist nets rather than harp traps, they would not have been sampling in a way that would guarantee them finding it. There were areas of the paper that were clearly fabricated. And so it is very likely that they were fabricating results based on those.
Yeah. So this is something I know it seems a bit like nitty-gritty, but this is just to show our visitors also that, scientists are not taking everything like, oh, they say so and now we take data as they are. No, they look at the details, they look at the data, and like I said, you look in the supplementary and it's like, does this really add up or not? So scientists are very critical, even with their own work, of course, but also with work from others. And they always try to get to the raw data and to their own analysis, double check, triple check, quadruple check. And, this is a process that happens. And if you have, in this case, there might be some political motivation to present a narrative, like John Cohen wrote in his article, to be favorable, like, it came from outside of China. That's why we didn't find anything. Could be another reason. But the point is that, people are there is scientific research ongoing, and the moment you move away from the raw data, the moment you move away from the transparency, from the collaboration, it's gonna get murky, it's gonna get speculative, it's gonna get less productive than it should be and could be.
And this is why, as you said, scientists are very critical. We like to debate. but it's necessary. We have to hold this data to a high standard because, I mean, I was living in a place where we didn't just have a conspiracy theory of it coming from a lab in Wuhan. We had the conspiracy theory of it coming from a lab in the US. We have both sides creating multiple different versions of how it might have come from and how it didn't come from here. And science is the pursuit of knowledge and truth, and that is what we need to focus on. With all of this background noise, with all the accusations, what matters is getting down to the truth and understanding what the data genuinely tells us.
Well, what I've a trend that I found very interesting over the last couple of weeks, especially in light of the Department of Energy study, is a lot of the
study.
Okay, fine.
Report.
Report. Yes. In light of that, a lot of the noisiest lab leak proponents, we all know who they are, I'm not going to mention them by name, have come out and they've all kind of been saying the same line, which is this is not a scientific problem. This is a forensic problem. This is a basically, CSI problem. We need to dig into this. We need to basically extract it from China because people are not being honest with us. It seems that when the data turns against these people, as we're going to talk about the data from the market today shortly, the goalposts quickly shift. That if the data is not there, well, that just means the data's been hidden. So off we go to the races again. Now, I'm sympathetic to the idea, and you've outlined some of it, that we might not have the full picture, we might not have the whole set of data. But when some data does appear, it's very quickly assimilated to prove that it's still a lab leak, or very quickly dismissed if it seems to lean towards zoonosis. So I've seen that trend. I don't know if both of you have picked up on that as well, that we seem to be moving away from, well, this is not really a science debate anyway. It's all about digging things out of China.
Yeah, so I sorry, Alice. Maybe
no,
you
go
first.
ahead.
Okay. So I wrote something very similar, which is basically that the moment, the evidence becomes more and more clear on this, natural and not research-related origin, at some point, healthy skepticism in the beginning that might have been there and critical thinking, for many people, they missed the point, or they got so entrenched in their belief that at this point it weighed into science denial, right? It's not saying, science is unclear, being open-minded, and, just because there's a dominant theory doesn't mean that alternatives shouldn't be checked, which was the argument up until, I would say, the Vorobey and Bekar science papers. This was the main narrative. And the moment these papers came out, people did not adjust their assessment, as, for example, the Department of Energy likely did, in saying, okay, maybe we have to start thinking about this market as this event where it all started. How could a research-related accident via sampling lead to that? So this is not what happened with the majority of people who advocate for lab leak. What happened is that they veered into science denial. They veered more into attacking scientists, inventing conflicts of interest. They veered into shifting the discussion, saying, actually, science cannot answer this question at all, which is surprising because science, really narrowed down all the uncertainties from complete uncertainty in multiple areas to very narrow uncertainties left here or there. And then they suddenly say, sorry, it's not about science. It's about getting the investigators and then discuss it in the courtrooms, the blame. And this is really a telling sign. This is what happened at many scientific controversies when you have an emerging consensus. And this is also what we have seen after the science papers. So more and more domain experts start seeing, okay, there is now a body of evidence, and the evidence speaks for itself. They're not getting instructions from Fauci, scientists in France, in Germany, in, all around the world. They're not getting instructions from Fauci. They are just like, oh yeah, I see this is the body of evidence, and it clearly points in one direction, right? And when you have this, then people suddenly saying science doesn't matter and veering into saying that's going to be discussed in the courtrooms. This is total science denial. This happened with climate change when they lost the climate discussion. This happens with, what was the other thing? Tobacco smoking originally, but there's a whole different, there's the whole, conflicted scientists topic emerging. So this is something that now many people that originally picked up on this conspiracy now really see themselves vindicated, because people are not going with the evidence. The uncertainty narrowed, and now the science denial increased. So this is not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting just how vociferous the FBI have been in their statements with Christopher Wray. There isn't any more data there. I mean, there is arguably the report this morning, which doesn't show those of us who have been following it anything new, even though it's now nice to have it demonstrated. But for many of these bodies, it's become an ideological argument. Something I would like to ask many of the lableak contingent is, what are they trying to achieve through these arguments? They are ignoring the science. They are ignoring the data. If it doesn't fit with the narrative that they are pushing, they will just find an excuse as to why the data is inconsistent or wrong, or why they can't put faith in it.
So their contention seems to be, I'm sorry to cut you off. Their contention seems to be that there has been no, what's the word that they used to do, the heavy lifting, credible investigation, right? Because, you know, your Warrabees, your Alice Hugheses, your Eddie Holmeses, your Angie Rasmussens, they all wanted this covered up. They're all worried about their funding. They're worried about that they won't be able to do gain of function every single day in their labs. This is the idea that there hasn't been a credible investigation. If you just do one more investigation by people who are very, very lab leak friendly, then, you know, it will all come out and we'll have everything that we need to have. That seems to be their idea, that just one more investigation, and then we'll be all sorted. That seems to be where they go with it. Basically, we don't trust any of you virologists because you're all shills and you're all kind of conflicted.
So where does your funding come from, Alice?
Multiple sources, but none of it was virological funding. The virological sequencing came from collaborators who probably can't work on any of this stuff anymore because they're in China. I work with a lot of different people, but other than meaning I decided to move from somewhere that had been my home for 9 years, there aren't benefits to doing this. It disrupts your life completely. And when it comes to what we are trying to achieve, we seem to be at risk of ignoring all the lessons we should be learning and putting in place what we need to stop this happening again, to play this blame game. And okay, I understand if the Department of Energy doesn't want to share the budget with actually having a pandemic prevention program, but what else is it trying to achieve by continuing this blame game? Continuing to prevent collaboration where we need collaboration. And science has always been a mechanism for diplomacy. It has been, after all of the major wars, it has been science that said, look, we need to have collaboration across borders to advance science. If we have now come to a time where ideology and politicization breaks those bridges, we're at a very difficult time, because this is a point in history where we need to look to the science so that we don't continue to make those mistakes. And the probability is, as it was the last time we talked, we are ignoring those lessons because ideology is becoming louder. And there are certain people, some of whom who have done very well off their book sales, who haven't managed to get papers through the peer-reviewed literature. And yet, if you look at any of the task forces advising government or on the radio, those people are the people who are being listened to, despite the fact that credible scientists who do peer review do not accept those viewpoints. And if you look at the very valid scientific criticisms, even of their preprints, which haven't been published, they are not able to answer them from a scientific perspective. And this is what we need to do, to look at the best science we have and understand how we can prevent this.
Yeah, in a sense, science is very unsatisfying because, you know, it's still slow, because it's rigorous, because it's error correcting, because it's so many voices trying to, you know, really get the details right. It's a very slow process. And when you have, you know, something quick, something media at the moment gets quicker and quicker because of the attention economy incentives. It's a very bad mix for science in media at the moment. And we've seen this. I want to pick your brain a little bit about what you think about the current testimonies that you see in the COVID committees in the US, when they have somebody like Jamie Metzel, the old Robert Redford, and also Nicholas Wade, basically presenting them as experts on the origins topic, when none of them really have anything to do with that. What is your thoughts about this?
Well, I think for one, they need to have experience with the science itself, especially the science of COVID, or even the ecology of some of these species and what is probable and where the risks really exist. And the other thing is, most of them do not have experience with China itself. And so they misinterpret the way that the country operates as cover up. Now, if you are covering up anything in order to control the dialogue, that doesn't mean that there is something there to cover up. And I think this is something that's been misinterpreted again and again. And then as politicization has increased, there has been a retraction, because if you know you're not going to get a fair hearing, then why try to say anything at all? And what we saw living within China was that within the first year of the pandemic, every Chinese Academy of Sciences center had task forces.
Yeah.
There were people who'd never worked on bats going out to collect data, and some of them did it very badly and should not have been doing it. They didn't know how to collect the and I was like, you don't have a biopsy punch to collect genetic tissue. You're using scissors, and this is things that was happening on the ground. That stopped.
But at least there was work, there was effort being put into it. There was a huge
amount of work. That work stopped because it stopped being a scientific issue and became an ideological one. And when you have no chance of a fair hearing, then you just withdraw. You retract, you stop the possibility of something. A local level official who might get blamed for COVID spilling over there doesn't want COVID to be found in wildlife, because then they're going to be responsible. And so, yeah, easy solution for me. And I mean, yeah, I lived in China. I saw when COVID flared up, however well or badly the provincial leaders did, they would still almost certainly lose their job because it was easy to scapegoat them. And so this is how things were handled. And so when you have people standing up in the US court who don't understand the dynamics of China, who don't understand about these viruses, and they are the ones saying what happened, then we are at a post-truth era. And yeah, it does feel a lot like we're living in an episode of Black Mirror, but I think everyone has had enough of this episode now and wants it to come to an end.
Oh dear. Philip, do you want to maybe if we talk a little bit about the?
No, I think we are so much aligned that it's actually boring for viewers on these issues. So I really want to challenge Alice a little bit on.
I'm happy to be challenged.
On the weeds of virus hunting and on her opinion on biosecurity labs. First, virus hunting. You said now Chinese scientists went out, they didn't even know how to do a wing punch, they didn't have the equipment. Doesn't that increase the risk dramatically of they bringing another pandemic?
Yes. Yeah, of course it does. I don't think virologists should be going to the field without having ecologists with them. If you see photos of virologists holding bats, now, okay, I'm going to be the nerdy bat scientist. There are ways of holding animals that are low risk of being bitten and low stress to the animal. So if we are holding a small bat, we pinion them between our fingers. It means that they, because of how their necks work, they are very unlikely to be able to bite you, and it's low stress to them. If you see photos of virologists holding bats, they normally do it by the elbow joints. That means that even if they release them, there is a very high risk of damage to their wings because they've got a heavy body and they have wings that are not designed to work that way. If they're using things like scissors to make a hole, the wings are very vascularized. They have sensors all over them for mechanoreceptors. They have blood vessels everywhere. If you make a big hole in that with scissors, then you may damage their ability to fly, even though their self-healing mechanisms are good. You're going to cause a lot of unnecessary injury and stress. Yes, you are exponentially going to increase the risk. But this isn't something that just applies in China. I think all over the world, virologists need to justify the number of animals they are killing, if they are killing animals at all by destructive sampling, and they need to have ethical training, just the way that most bat scientists would do, because it's a high specialism thing.
So just to interrupt you for a second here. So there was this PREDICT program that some people blame for the pandemic. So PREDICT was this from the US aid sponsored program about, finding and identifying spillover hotspots. And it was, hundreds of millions that went into this, and now it's fallen out of grace basically. But a lot of the money actually was about capacity building, training, and equipping scientists to do this work responsibly, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I mean,
so how do you feel about
EcoHealth, which often gets a lot of bad press, a lot of their scientists were actually bat biologists before. They know how to handle them. They go out and they work with bat organizations so we can do it properly. Yes, that is what we need. We need to have best practice. We need people who understand both the virological component and the ecological component. And so, those are good things. Stopping them is not going to prevent viruses. It just means that we're going to reinvent the wheel a lot less efficiently.
So this is a bit of an interesting question to me. So when often the question is like, is it not better to just not go out into nature? Just let them be, don't waste the money on it. Just do surveillance on farms and markets and, let it be. Don't go out into the wild. What is your feeling about this line of argumentation?
I mean, that's like saying, okay, well, don't have your regular health check for things like certain cancers. And I mean, a lot of people in the West will be doing those very uncomfortable checks for cancer. Now, you don't have to do those, but you might find that you have cancer and it's too late to treat it. It's the same thing. Biosurveillance is telling us there is a risk of something before it becomes unmanageable. Yeah. If we know an area is a hotspot for certain viruses, if we know by fragmenting it we're going to increase the rate of spillover, we can do something to stop it happening. And like every other sector, prevention is a lot less costly than cure.
So, and this, I think, is one of these troubles. So I also have been interviewing a lot of field workers recently. And this is something that they say it's so frustrating because if they are successful, right? If prevention is successful, people don't see anything. And then people are like, why did we spend so much money on something
survivorship
that wasn't a problem? And this is really, this is catastrophic if you think about this.
Because, you can't count the car crashes that don't happen.
I can't count the number of times you could just post that Spitfire meme throughout this entire lableak debate. Like, you can post it for Fury and Cleavage site. If you're talking about a pandemic virus, as a physicist, I already know, don't apply like general trends to something that is extreme by definition. This is a pandemic virus, so it's gonna look extreme. It's gonna look human adapted, because if it didn't, it wouldn't have become a pandemic virus. So I've already zoomed in. You can't look at things like that. You can't. You need to get past that survivorship bias. Are you looking at the time, by the way, Alice? I'm just cognizant of your time.
I was
still your Friday evening.
It's still early for me. I had meetings till midnight last night. I have a great fun life. We often miss that first phase. So it was probably really bad at passing between people at first, but you don't pick it up then. Yeah. You only pick it up when it hits a certain level. Yeah. And by that point, you may already have mutations that enable it to spread more efficiently. And for those things that don't get good at it, you probably don't know they were ever there because they fizzled out before you actually detected they were there in the first place.
Yeah, and this is I think what pandemic prevention people don't understand is, any kind of, large endeavor, you have to have anticipation. And how do you gonna inform your anticipation if you don't go out into the wild and, figure out, what's going on? And this is something that's so, and maybe people think, now we know, and this is something I'm going to ask you now. They think like, okay, but now we know there are viruses out there. You don't have to go out anymore. We know, we just, stop it and it's fine. We know everything we need to know. No more need to invest more money. What would you say about this?
We could have said 50 years ago, we know there are viruses out there. It's not going to stop them from spilling over. There's still a lot more we need to know. And I think the recent Hendra paper is a really good idea of how those dynamics are really important, because that represents the intersection of landscape management, species reproduction and demography, and season, things like climate events. Unless you have data on what those dynamics look like, you're not going to be able to understand the impacts of the risks of spillover. Another great example, TB in badgers. I could make myself very unpopular with a lot of my family because I grew up on a farm, and like every farm in the UK, they want to cull the badgers. And you're like, but the evidence shows that if you cull them, then you actually increase the TB spread because you basically stress them out and make them move, and the data shows this. I mean, yeah.
This is also what they recently showed for rabies, right? Or maybe not recently.
Keep saying because it's obvious. But we still need to have better data on what it looks like because it shows us how you can actually manage it. And these things do spread in different ways. It also becomes a lot more chaotic if bats are involved because bats are like super animals that don't work like other mammals.
Yeah.
And I say that because they can host these viruses without showing any symptoms, and because every cell in their body functions in a very different way from the rest of mammals. So we definitely need a lot more work there. But in most circumstances, we need to understand these dynamics better. And even through the pandemic, that is the element that falls through the cracks. The fact that we need to understand the intersection of natural risk factors like reproduction, hibernation, and migration with those climatic events and with the landscape governance, because it's when you get the intersection of those that you exponentially increase the risk of spillover.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a nice point. Also, it's not just one thing, right? Pandemic. It's not just that if we stop this or that, and this is the idea, and this is, I guess, why it's so viral and so hopeful for people who spread this lableak ideas. For them, it's like if we just stop these virologists from doing gain of function research, we will not have another pandemic. So this is so wrong, but it's such a hopeful message to that extent that we have control over it. It's just if we stop scientists from fucking up, no more pandemics. And this is just such a
it's such a populist message as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because most people don't understand these things.
It's
an easy message. It's an easy message for people to understand.
When has science been easy? It's like scientists, we're all very complicated.
But there's almost like a level of, there's a level of anti-institutionalism with it, right? Because scientists, part of an institution, blah blah. There's also kind of almost level of anti-intellectualism in the sense of you don't really know what they're doing, and if you just stop them from doing it, you never have to worry about it. So it's a very easy message for people to kind of get behind, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really dramatic because I talked to some other people who were doing like avian influenza surveillance in Cambodia, and they said they stopped outbreaks, right? And if avian influenza, and we just had the avian influenza scare coming also from Cambodia, and the people on the ground said, okay, but this is a different virus, and it's not it's been spilling over humans before, so it's these people really are doing complicated stuff every day and work 5 different angles trying to minimize risk. And of course, you cannot completely, and this is one of these arguments, it's like, all this work and still pandemic's gonna happen. Yes, but it's about the frequency and the severity, because not every outbreak has to turn into a pandemic. And, you can reduce the amount of outbreaks you will have per year, per decade, or even per century. And this is what scientists are doing.
Another good example with the avian influenza, I remember talking to UK colleagues over the summer, and they said, they're about to release thousands of pheasants into the UK countryside. Now, some of those pheasants will have avian influenza and they can spill over into anything. And we are seeing more spillovers into mammals. Now, the pheasant hunting industry is a high value one, and the demographic of people who shoot are probably voting for the Tories.
All I can think is Danny, champion of the world, when you start talking about releasing pheasants into the... I don't know if you know that story.
This is a UK thing. I don't know.
Of course I know that. I grew up in the UK.
That's how I used to listen to it all the time on audiobook when I was a kid. Sorry. Just had to get that.
Well, now all of those pheasants are dead and he's not going to get to shoot them.
Give them sleeping tablets and they all fall down. Sorry. Just had to put it out.
No, I like the randomness of where these discussions can go.
There was a couple of things that kind of crossed my timeline. One is related to China. I don't know if we want to discuss it, Philip. This kind of narrative. Someone has been arrested. I'm not exactly sure of the background of this. Do you want to give a little bit on that, and we can maybe talk about that if
this is not my work necessarily, but I've been recently getting more curious about, how did, this bioweapon conspiracy start? I know it started from China. I know that, there was immediately rumors, even in the first few weeks after, the outbreak became clear in January. But, what was the first like super spreading event of this? This is usually how information cascades when something goes viral in social media or in the news. How did that start? And what happened basically is that there's this Chinese dissident billionaire who was basically pushing this bioweapon conspiracy very early. And now he was arrested.
Gu Wengui?
So he has like 5 different names because of Cantonese and Yinbin translations. I think he goes by Miles Guo in westernized media.
And I have a Chinese name. We all had to.
Yeah, exactly. And so the point is that he created he put a lot of money into spreading the bioweapon conspiracy. So he's a bit of a news media tycoon. So he has his own social media web pages, promotional sites, G News it's called, something like that. And he was working close together with Steve Bannon. And basically this link between him and Steve Bannon is what created this bioweapon conspiracy that then swapped over into the US to be used as a cudgel against China. And also for example, they were the ones that cultivated Li Men Yan, this alleged whistleblower from the University of Hong Kong. Maybe you know her? No?
I know of her, and I was looking at some of those papers earlier.
Yeah, so she basically was a participant in creating some fake scientifically looking papers, total bollocks, but pushing this bioweapon conspiracy into mainstream. And so it turns out that this guy was arrested just a couple of days ago. Now, why was he arrested? Well, it turns out, like many of these scammers, he used these conspiracy theories, not only lableak, but the bioweapon was a big part of that, to gain viewers, to catch eyeballs, to get amplified, to catch more people into his G News kind of environment, into his media bubble. The moment he had more people in his bubble, he started advertising to them, so usually this catches people that are very gullible, right? A bioweapon conspiracy is something that, you don't fall without any evidence until you're a bit gullible in that regard. And so he kind of got a lot of these gullible people together, and then he started promoting these fraud crypto schemes, fraud financial investment schemes, and so forth. And in the end, it turns out that he defrauded thousands or tens of thousands of people for hundreds of millions in the end. Even $1 billion, I think, was the higher number. So he defrauded them enormously. He took all of that money to amplify the bioweapon conspiracy further, to get more people in the US involved, to also defraud. So this is also where, it's financially incentivized to do this kind of things, to get more people that then can defraud in your pyramid schemes. And he bought, expensive villas and yards, and I don't know what's 300 million, I think, is just the things that he spent for himself, and a few hundred of millions on other crap. I don't really understand it. He's now being indicted because of these financial scams that he was running. But yeah, this is part of why I say, there's a lot of artificial and inauthentic narrative around this topic. While there was a scientific uncertainty in the beginning, the bioweapon part was clearly a conspiracy from day one. So there is no question. There was no legitimate concern, anything. No, it was a fabricated conspiracy myth with the goal of catching eyeballs, to bring people into this environment, to defraud them. And this is something that people reacted to. And this is something that Facebook reacted to, because Facebook did not, as people now redirect, shut down the lableak discussion. No, what it did is shut down the bioweapon discussion, because it had seen this inauthentic behavior, which was amplified by bots on Facebook, and that's why they moderated.
They know how to weaponize it.
Exactly. So they already, and I mean, Facebook knows they've been the platform has been weaponized by so many actors. They just didn't want another PR scandal. That's why they shut down this bioweapon conspiracy, because it was, actors like Bannon that used this bot network, this inauthentic amplification mechanisms in order to scam people. And that's why they shut it down. And now, all the lableak people turn around and say, oh, look, it was censored. No, it was not. Consumers were protected from being defrauded. Facebook actually did the right thing for half a second. And on Twitter and on YouTube, anyway, they didn't do
even
anything.
a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a bit of the history, and maybe at some point somebody will work this up and write about it, because I think this is a scandal also, because this is a huge part, and this is important also. So this amplification from Miles Guo and Steve Bannon at the time was directly feeding it into the White House. This is why the State Department under Pompeo was pushing the bioweapon conspiracy. This is what informed Trump and China virus. So this immediately got right-wing ideologically coded, because it could be used as a cudgel against China to distract from the pandemic failings of the early US response under Trump, under Redford, who is now trying to cover his tracks. So yeah, it all is political, unfortunately, not because the scientists make it political, but because the politicians saw an opportunity to weaponize it. And scientific uncertainty in the beginning was higher, but now it's narrower, even completely, to the point where you say it's not realistic.
At what point of data do we need in order to make a conclusion? I mean, I don't think it's the right or the useful question to be asking, trying to find bat zero.
Yeah.
But the reality is that when people are convinced of something, many of them will always find a reason not to believe the data, no matter how strong it is. And so there comes a point where you have to say, look, we need to stop the singular focus, and we need to look at how we can prevent ourselves from falling into the same trap again. And that isn't the dialogue we are having. In fact, if anything, these low confidence reports are only getting louder, and it's becoming more political. I mean, I'm on the database of the Science Media Centre in the UK. We get a question almost every day at the moment, because this is so much in the public eye. And it's not because there was new data. It's because it's becoming more of a political issue, but also because the people who are being asked as the scientific referees are not scientists who know about it. Yeah. They are particular actors that have their own political motivations to be selling a narrative, and that is devoid of any further data or science.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, because on the one hand, we have science and they say, look, we don't have perfect certainty, which you never have with outbreaks usually, but we have actionable certainty. We have a reasonably high degree of confidence that this is how the pandemic started, meaning via the Huanan market and a direct spillover from the animals there. Maybe we don't know exactly how the animals got there. We don't exactly know if it was a raccoon dog, or maybe the raccoon dog was an intermediate from something. We don't understand this yet. Okay, but this doesn't mean that, this kind of wildlife trade was the obvious target. This kind of animal interfaces, coronavirus surveillance, all these things, pandemic surveillance, pandemic playbooks that have nothing to do, even if it's coming out from a lab, you need a functioning pandemic playbook after that. So all these things that we should be discussing now politically, that should be implemented now, nothing is happening, and it's been not happening for a long time.
Think of fur farms.
Yeah.
Now, fur farms are full of stressed small carnivores and mustelids. We have seen coronavirus going into and out of mink multiple times. Have we seen any control of that anywhere? I mean, even the new wildlife protection laws in China specifically focus on consumption. They do not touch fur farms, which are higher value and in large part for export. All of those preconditions still exist all over the world, and they are not being talked about either.
Yeah.
We haven't dealt with any of the risk factors. Instead, we've thrown up our hands in the air. We've plugged some holes that, in most part, didn't really need plugging and that don't tackle the issues. And we haven't done it in a systematic way. We have failed to learn any of the main lessons from this. And rather than the UK or other countries reinstating proper pandemic protection programs, we're still being like, well, we need to find who to blame. That's what we should be doing.
Yeah, and it's just ridiculous, because also, yes, give scientists some time to figure it out. blame before evidence is just, it's like witch hunts, right? I'm sorry, but there is no, and what is the point of blame? The point of blame is not given. There should be accountability in the sense that, look, if there could be an identification of a process or a lab or whatever it be, then there must be accountability. There must be, inform our decisions to prevent any of these things happening again. All right, understand. This is the reason why we should do this. Good. But then what should we do about the known risk about pandemics that are super high? There's going to be like a 10% chance in the next decade or something that then another pandemic is going to come, if not higher, depending on estimates. So what are we going to do about that before we talk about the 0.001% odds of, somebody in the lab creating another virus, right? It's a mess.
Do we want to finish?
I think so,
Philip, with kind of the stuff from today and how important we think it is, or what it adds or maybe doesn't add. And
so maybe I start quickly because I didn't sleep a lot after this came out. So one problem I think is,
do you want to tell people what it is first of all?
Yes. So all right. Sorry. So yesterday night there was an Atlantic article that came out.
Morning here.
This morning, yeah. Basically,
you're ahead. You get
giving a scoop about a meeting that happened from a bunch of origin researchers, so a bunch of virologists and evolutionary biologists that basically but they realized that Chinese scientists had uploaded some data that weren't previously available, but that the scientists were expecting should come eventually, and they found this data available, and they did some preliminary analysis, and they presented this analysis to SAGO, which is the WHO's body for investigating pandemic origins. So this is basically the story. So there is some new data. They presented it in front of an expert committee, kind of behind closed doors to this point, because the analysis are not done. There's no paper out. There's nothing publicly available. But a journalist heard about this and decided this is a scoop that cannot wait, and pushed out this scoop that, this meeting happened, what this meeting entails, what the details are. And the details are that they indeed found genomic evidence from environmental samples at the Huanan market in Wuhan that show that animals were there at the market and in the samples that tested positive. So when you take an environmental swab, right, you sweep away some material, and then you do a metagenomic sequencing, basically looking for any and all sequences you can find into this data. And this work was performed by the Chinese CDC. This was George Gau's preprint, but they have not made this metagenomic sequencing data available, and now they did for a short period of time, and we can talk about this as well. So they did. The scientists presented this, and now the journalist reported it. And this caused a huge media flare because there was also a very sensationalist headline again saying, this is now the strongest evidence we have for its zoonotic origin, which is, my eye was a bit twitching, because it's like, first, we already had strong evidence for zoonotic origin. Second, this is a minor part of the big picture. So it's not make or break. This is just one more puzzle piece to the picture that's already pretty complete.
But one of the main things that people say is, and it's almost become a kind of the mantra of anyone who's skeptical, is what animal? You can't say what animal. So if you can point to this as a possible animal that might have been the spillover, that's interesting and that's good.
Yeah. So I think
of course, on the other side, people will say, well, maybe these animals just got infected at the market from a spread that came somewhere else, right? So this seems to be where people are going to now, that the animals at the market got infected by spread from elsewhere.
So the way I see it is that basically there's three takeaways. The first takeaway is that, co-occurrence doesn't necessarily mean that the animal was infected. So this is not a conclusive proof. It's, very likely if other environmental swabs don't have this co-occurrence, but these ones where there's, a high positivity of, virus together with the animals, it's at least expected, I would say. This is the one thing. Second, it doesn't
necessary but not sufficient. Should we
exactly. That's a good way to put it. second, what is the more important part about this, in my opinion, is not that, oh, it's raccoon dog or some other animal sequences they found in there, that this is going to be the original animal. No, this just proves that these animals were here. And remember, China has been denying for years, or maybe from day one, that there were these animals at the market. And now we have 3 different lines of evidence to prove that they were there. First one is the Xiao paper that if surveyed the market from 2017 to 2019 and say, okay, raccoon dogs, for example, were there. The second line of evidence is photographic evidence, where people, Eddie Holmes went to the market in 2014, photographed raccoon dogs. People on the
He has
WeChat,
videos of them sneezing as well.
Yeah. People on the WeChat app were posting pictures of these animals that the scientists later found in December of 2019. So this is photographic evidence that also they tried to submit to the WHO, but the Chinese said, sorry, we can't verify these photos. So point is that the 2 lines of evidence already that raccoon dogs were there, but now the third one is the kicker. Now we have the genetic evidence that these environmental samples that have the virus are contaminated for whatever reason with raccoon dogs. So that means raccoon dogs were there. There's no denying anymore. And this hopefully should enable a more serious discussion about next steps, about investigating where were the animals sourced from, go behind this denial and say, look, can we check fur farms, please? Can we please interview people asking them about the raccoon dogs? So this might be the hope that this new data can provide. And the third takeaway is for the lab leak, it will not make a difference. So the evidence was already one-sided. It adds a little bit more in this one-sidedness. People that were not, putting all their odds already on zoonotic lab leak, if they're still on the lab leak side, they will not change minds, because for them it's not about evidence. For them it's about an entrenched worldview. It's about an entrenched beliefs that they need to defend. And so the next few days, and we are very early, so this is good that we have the video today, they will see that there will be obfuscation about these results. There will be more noise created about it. There will be denial that we've seen already. There will be new insults against the scientists who performed this work. They will say, Eddie Holmes again, oh, he fabricated this data together with George Gao. This is, I'm saying, I quote because I've seen it right in front of me today. So these things are to be expected from this community, but of course, this has nothing to do with science. This has everything to do with dynamics beyond the science. Yeah. All right. So sorry for this monologue. Now, Alice, what is your thoughts about it?
It's true. I first actually heard about these swabs in April 2020.
Yeah.
Because they'd already been done by then, and because I know people who work with George Gao. It wasn't information I wanted at the time, because then it was incredibly confidential, and you're like, I have knowledge that the world wants that I can't mention, and I'm in China where, it was not comfortable. I'm very glad that a lot of this information is more public now and has been substantiated and can be linked to, because we do need to have this information. The problem is that, as I noted earlier, fur farms are not covered in any of the new wildlife laws, so they can continue to exist. And because raccoon dogs are wild within China, there is still the capacity to launder animals into these fur farms. What we need to have, and what has not been strongly looked at, is better systems of inventory and other modes that make sure that you don't mix wild and captive bred animals. Many larger livestock facilities will have modes of quarantine, very high biosafety standards because of the risks of things like swine flu. We should be having these kinds of operations at any type of large animal facility, just because otherwise there are these inherent risks. And those I have not heard being discussed. And so we know what discussions we should be having. Yeah. We don't seem very good at having them. And my main fear is, we have more data now public that was only private before. How are we going to act on it in a way that actually takes us forward, rather than it just being the latest snowball to throw on the heap? Because this is what it has become. It's become a mudslinging match rather than actually trying to move towards any form of consensus.
I think that's a good summary.
Philip, do you want to end on a positive note, or?
Oh no! Don't give me that. I usually forces people to do this. So yes, I think there has been a lot of politicization, a lot of discourse servers trying to kind of swoop in and do this meta-analysis about, narratives. I think this is gonna be counterproductive. I think people are waking up to this being counterproductive. Maybe not this year still. Maybe it's still gonna take another election cycle in the US in order for people to tire of these narratives. But there's new regulation in the EU regulating digital spaces to do better moderation, to de-escalate these amplification mechanisms that drive most of these things. There's ongoing science getting closer and closer to give a more complete picture. There is over time always, there's going to be a shift of attention and a de-escalation, and this will be more productive. The moment we can talk to Chinese scientists and start exchanging data, start exchanging ideas, start collaborating again, this origin discussion will be way less complicated for outsiders. It will be way more accessible. The scientific consensus at the moment is not heard. It will get louder. So at the moment, it's still an emerging consensus among domain experts. It will get louder. It will get more complete. And we just have to bridge this gap between now and, let's say, a year and a half, trying to make sure that people don't get, manipulated. And, my part, what I've been trying to do recently is trying to show people some of these mechanisms that manipulate people with sensationalist headlines, with, inauthentic amplification and so forth. Because when people are a bit less, likely to just, hang on the news and, fight each other, then science has bigger chances of being heard and the data will come through. I mean, you can only get fooled about the science if you don't hear about the science to an extent. Evidence has a way of breaking through, even for people with entrenched worldviews. They just have to get into a space where they are not constantly provoked to defend themselves so hard. And I think we are going to reach this point latest, and this is maybe a good and bad note, latest when the next pandemic comes and people will realize that it's happened exactly the same way, then this will clear up. Of course, we hope this will not happen. We hope the next pandemic can be contained before it goes, as bad as COVID-19 did. Maybe it's going to be an outbreak like SARS-1. But, this is what happened, for example, in Western Africa. So I talked to some people recently there. They had this Ebola outbreak, and people, Ebola comes from monkeys and butchering monkeys, and people wouldn't believe it. They believed the US kind of, there were labs there. The US fabricated this Ebola outbreak by studying the Ebola virus in West Africa. And this is what caused the West African Ebola outbreak from 2014 to 2016. And they were very entrenched in that view for years. The moment the COVID pandemic happened, people were better prepared to deal with the restrictions that the COVID pandemic demanded. And there was a certain revisionism towards Ebola, and people started appreciating, actually, it was likely that Ebola also came from animals. Now that they're seeing that COVID came, outbreak from China, now they're like, okay, actually, it makes sense, that it also. So there's always hope. People grow wiser. People get better when they have repeated, if they run into the same mistake repeatedly, they will learn from it. But obviously, we don't want to go and get it as bad. And I have to go. Sorry.
Alice, any closing remarks? Oh, he's got a...
I will, as Philip runs away.
I don't know what happened there. Somebody at the door, I guess.
The concrete jungle. There have been some significant advancements in recent months. There is a quadripartite on One Health. The CBD did not have a target on One Health, but it does have an entire annex, and there are multiple new organizations that focus on One Health. So it is becoming part of the global dialogue as it needs to, but governments do need to prioritize it and to provide funding for ecologists and virologists to work together so that we can find the kinds of solutions we need to manage these ecosystems. And I think as scientists, despite all of the drama and the noise and the politicization, we need to remember that there will always be a place for science. And that if we don't speak out with genuine evidence-based science, then no one will. And even though that is often immensely challenging and does come at huge personal cost rather than the glorification that some people seem to think it does, if we can't speak our science, then how do we expect things to improve? And so, by doing our best to stand by our science and develop better solutions, then hopefully we can do something to at least prevent the effects of the next pandemic.
So sorry, everybody.
It's all right. I think that's probably a really good place to leave it. Alice, do you want to send people anywhere to look at anything, find out more about what you're doing?
When is your paper coming?
Yeah, when is the paper coming out? That'd be a good place to
Not sure at the moment, but I might be able to think of some useful things to put into the
Send them on later, and we can put them in the description underneath.
In the blurb. Okie doke.
Philip, do you have any closing remarks before we close up?
No, I think I aired my grievances. I'm so happy that Alice took some time also, because I think she really has good insights about these things. And, it gives you a very different perspective if you've been doing this for, not just parachuted in when the pandemic hit, but you've been doing this for, all your life, basically, or at least for
I'm still happy to go and hide in my cave and not hear the political drama, especially if there are bats to share the space with.
Yeah. So it's always very well appreciated. And yeah, let's hope we get some feedback on this conversation as well. It's always nice to hear from people and spread the word that, scientists are not evil. They are humans, and they just do their best to even within the circumstances, and especially when there is a pandemic, to prevent.